Welcome to lecture 8. So in this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about shells, and then we're going to discuss the idea of a botnet. We'll discuss different botnet architectures, and then we'll look at the Mirai botnet. The source code for the Mirai botnet's linked in the PDF. So let's get started. Before we dive into botnets, let's talk about scanning. And this is just a really shallow dive into scanning. We'll talk a lot more about scanning and in much more detail when we get to chapter 8. There's a tool called Nmap, and Nmap's a great tool to have in your toolbox. It lets you do a variety of scans, and the -sv flag is one of the most useful flags. So if you do -sv and then some IP address, this is going to do a scan and it's going to do some version detection. So it's going to tell you what version of a service is running on a particular port. And as we saw with our FTP attack, knowing the version of the service then lets you look up known vulnerabilities about that service and then compromise that service and maybe gain access to the machine. I encourage you to go ahead and run this scan against the metasploitable machine and see all the information you get on the versions of particular services. So just a little note on how this scanning works. Remember last time we discussed TCP, the transmission control protocol that's used at the transport layer. And when we discussed TCP, we talked about the TCP handshake. And so one way that we could check to see if a port is open, so here's our machine and these empty slots are open ports, and say this is like metasploitable. And we want to discover, and then we'll symbolize closed ports with these squiggly things here. So say this is port 80, port 443. Say this is port 667. This one's 680, and so on. So one way we could detect if a port is open is that we could have some TCP client over here, and then this TCP client could go ahead and establish connections to each port. So it would do the three-way handshake that we discussed before. And then if that's successful, then it will say, oh, that port is open to outside traffic. And then say it was communicating one of these closed ports, it would do the three-way handshake and it would say, oh, I can't actually get access to that port. It must be closed. And so that will show up as a closed port in the scan, while 80 would show up as an open port. So doing the three-way handshake, the SYN-ACK handshake, that's actually 3 messages. And so that takes a lot of time. And if you're scanning a lot of ports, this is going to be time consuming and slow down your whole process. So one thing you could do is instead of sending SYN-ACK, and then the ACK, what you could do is maybe just send SYN. So you say, okay, start a connection by saying SYN. And then if it comes back and it says SYN-ACK, then it's open. And so this makes the scan a little faster. Just a little bit faster. You can enable this type of scan with Nmap, where you just do Nmap -scan with an S, and this will do a SYN scan. So it will only send SYN packets, and then it will wait for the acknowledgement. And the other thing is that you could send multiple SYN packets simultaneously, right? Because you're not blocking waiting for the SYN-ACK. So you could send multiple SYNs to multiple ports, and then every port that comes back with a SYN-ACK, then you know that's valid. So then you get this extra advantage that you can do things in parallel. So we also talked about this notion that some firewalls block incoming connections, but allow outgoing connections. And so could we in some way circumvent the firewall? So if we're looking at an incoming connection, it's going to start with a SYN, and then it's going to have a SYN-ACK associated with it. And then afterwards, there's another ACK. And then there's going to be information that's sent. And remember, to close the connection, we get a FIN and then neck. So things inside of the network are allowed to establish connections. I'll put here. Things inside the network are allowed to establish connections with the outside world. And so that means that SYN packets can flow this way, but SYN packets cannot flow this way. And so that's one way that you can block incoming connections. But once a connection is established, right, data can still flow in here after the client has established a connection with the outside world. That's why the reverse shell is so useful and lets us circumvent things like firewalls and nets. So what we could do here is that towards the end, once the connection has been established, when it's being closed, it means that the firewall allows a SYN packet from the outside world. And so what we could do is we could also just enable a scan where instead of doing SYNs, we start the scan with FINs. And this will help us get around some of the firewalls. And so you can do this by doing Nmap -scan with FIN. There's some other really unique things too, right? So every OS and version of that OS and NIC cards and other hardware, they're going to process all of these things at different speeds, and they're going to have different nuances in their implementation. And so what we could do is play with the TCP headers, right? Because remember, all these SYN, FIN, ACK, these are all just flags in our TCP header. And so we can go ahead and look at these flags and then say, oh, this is how we should treat them if we're processing the TCP connection on the OS side. This is where we are in our state machine. This is where we are in our exchange. So we know how to process those things. And so these implementations of TCP are different based on OS version and so on. And so if we can craft a packet that is strange, and that might be processed by different versions and different OSs in different ways, means that we can start to fingerprint which OS and which version based on how they handle that packet. And so one thing that we could do is we could set the FIN flag so that we get past the firewall. And then we could set another flag called a push flag, and then another flag called a urge flag. It's for urgent. These are rarely actually used in modern TCP connections. And because they're so rarely used, the way that each OS interprets the specification for how to process them is different. And so each OS and each implementation is going to treat this packet just a little differently because it has these two extra rarely used flags enabled. So it's this edge case. And so everybody's going to process this edge case differently. And so we can use it to fingerprint or just get more information about some OS or particular TCP stack that's running on that machine. And this scan here is called an XMES scan. And the reason it's called an XMES scan is that if you look at the flags in Wireshark, so if you take that packet and you open it up and you look at the flags, will look like a Christmas tree, the ones that are set. So it's called an XMES scan. So that's just a rough introduction to scanning. One thing that I'd like to note is that I've pointed out a lot here where you want to make sure to notice what version's running and so on, and that's actually a very powerful thing to know. And that's because once you know what version is running, you can go ahead and look up in databases like the NVD or National Vulnerability Database for vulnerabilities associated with that application. So here we knew that the FTP application was vulnerable, but you might find, oh, that SSH was vulnerable, or that version of Postgres is vulnerable, and then you can go ahead and exploit that service. And so this is one of the reasons that version scanning and fingerprinting is so important, because it really helps you to figure out what is this system, what are its vulnerabilities, how can I attack it? And you might come across a system that's completely up to date with no known vulnerabilities. And then in that case, what you want to do is spend some time discovering some 0 days. You can also do some other tactics like social engineering and so on, but a good 0 day can be very powerful. So let's talk a little bit about writing one of these reverse shells. So the key thing, I'm not going to discuss the source code here. I think we're comfortable kind of reading the PDFs now to see this source code and look for line by line explanations. And so I'd like to dedicate these sessions to more high level ideas. So the key thing with the reverse shell is that every command that we send on our TCP connection that we establish with the server gets passed to the underlying OS, and particularly the shell in the underlying OS. So we can execute shell commands directly on the underlying OS. And we do this by spawning. So here's our first process with our TCP client. And what we do is we spawn, fork, a child process that's running the shell of the OS, and we pass the commands from our TCP client to our forked shell. And we pass the results back up to our TCP client, and then the TCP client onto the TCP server. So that's the kind of general idea of what's happening there with the architecture. Some ways might be you load the binary directly through an exploit, like a buffer overflow. The other way is that you could, if you're on the machine, you can download more stuff. So you might get what's called a stager, or just a first stage onto the machine. It might be a very simple, thin application. And what it will do is it will do something like a webget, where it will go ahead and it will fetch something more. This is also called kind of a loader. And it will fetch some more files that will give you more capabilities. In this case, maybe it will fetch a more complicated version of the reverse shell. And so in the write-up, we actually go through a process of setting up an HTTP server in Python, very simple, only one line, and then downloading your reverse shell onto the metasploitable machine using just the wget command. So say you broke in to the machine first with that FTP backdoor, then you could download, do a webget, your Python shell that you wrote, and there you go. Now you have a more advanced shell on the machine. Now we've talked about shells, let's talk about this idea of a botnet. So what is a botnet and why is it useful? A botnet is a collection of machines that have been compromised. So here we might have M1, M2, and 3, and they're all running some malware. And instead of the hacker just connecting to one machine, so this might be hacker 1, hacker 2, hacker 3, I have to go ahead and just connect to one machine. I would like to be able to control multiple machines simultaneously. What you can do is you could set up what's called a C2, or command and control server. And all the bots will connect to this command and control server. And then a single hacker prime 1 can connect to this command and control server and then can issue a command to all the bots, like mine Bitcoin. Bitcoin miners are one of the reasons for botnets. You can use PCs to go ahead and mine Bitcoin, and Bitcoin's hard to trace. And that's one way to earn money from this. You can also rent the botnet out for a DDoS attacks. So you could say something like ping some IP address, and then all of these machines, this command will go down to all of these machines, and all of these machines will execute that ping command. And here's some web server like cs.virginia.edu. All of these machines will go ahead and ping that CS server simultaneously and overwhelm it. And so this is just one C2 architecture. So here, let's scroll up here. So one approach is that you could have some central machine, or some central hacker here, hacker one, and he has one machine, and this one machine controls several bots. And this is referred to as the client server model. So here, this is our server, and these are our clients. And whenever a new bot's created, whenever somebody compromises a new machine, it goes ahead and it connects to the C2 server. This is also referred to as CNC for command and control. So C2, CNC, or CNC, like that. So you'll see all of those kind of referring to this machine. If you wanted to control this botnet or stop this botnet, one of the things that makes sense to do is to attack that machine or take over that machine in some way. And all of these bots have to know, the IP address of that machine to connect to it. If you have some firewall here and you're listening for traffic, you could capture that traffic and then you could figure out the IP address of this machine. One way to block this machine from your network or stop that machine from communicating with anything in your network is you blacklist, which is not a very good name, the IP address of the CNC. And so now no longer can that CNC control bots in your network. One way that attackers try to do this to stop people from taking over CNC is they use a strategy where they actually use the DNS service as a way of changing the mapping between their IP address and some domain. One of the services that used this was the Mirai botnet. This is a big botnet that affected a lot of Internet of Things devices like cameras and turned them into botnets, routers as well. And the author of Mirai actually describes this scheme on the GitHub page associated with the botnet. So there's a capture of a forum post where he or she describes this infrastructure and why it was so difficult to take down. I strongly recommend that reading. And it's linked in the PDF as well, under the GitHub link to the Mirai source code. So you can go ahead and read all the source code for that particular botnet. So one of the things you can do is you could say, okay, here's some address like www.xyz.com. And this address can be generated. So first the bots will connect to xyz.com, and then they have some code in them that will say, and xyz.com will connect to 192.168.1.103, for example. Although this would be a public-facing IP, not a private one. So here, this would be the mapping. So these two would be connected. And then if somebody blocks this, the bot periodically will generate new URLs. So it will generate another one like a2fg.com. And then that will be associated with another IP address that the hacker controls. And then that might get generated again at a different time. Like, it might generate something else like b4326.io. And that's associated with another IP address. So every time a system admin blocks one of these IPs, or they go ahead and request to the DNS server to remove one of those IPs, the hacker knows what the next sequence is going to be, the next IP address in the sequence is going to be, and they can go ahead and register that. And when they register that, they'll have control of the bots again, because the bots will connect to that new address. One clever strategy for breaking or taking over these bots is to pre-register your IP. So pre-register that particular domain. So if you figure out what the pattern is and how the bots are searching for domains, maybe it's like a.1, 2, 3, and then to make this more complicated, maybe it's a hash of these, and then taking a part of the hash. So if you can figure out what that pattern is, then you can pre-register that domain and run your own command and control server and take over all the bots. And you can have them do something like delete bot code. And then you've deleted all the bots. Right now, you've taken down the bot infrastructure completely. So this is a clever strategy. So let's look at a concrete example of this architecture in play. Here we have our CNC server, and it has an IP address associated with it, 172.168.1.103. And we have our bots. So A1, so we'll have some bot B1, B2, and B3. And we want them to know how to connect to this CNC server. So we'll have some DNS server here, and this DNS server will have some mapping. So maybe we'll say a1.com maps to this IP address here, which is the IP address of the CNC server. So the bots all know to connect when they get deployed to connect to a1.com. And so they'll go out to the DNS server and say, okay, I want to connect to a1.com. And the DNS server will say, okay, a1.com is at 172.168.1.103. And then they'll reach out to the CNC server and they'll connect to it. So all of them will do that. And so then some sysadmins notice that, hey, a1.com is actually malicious. Let's block it on our network. So then that shuts down all those bots on that particular network. So we'll go to the DNS company, the companies that run the DNS server, and we'll say, hey, block a1.com. That is a bad address. Delete it from your records. New bots that come online say, okay, a1.com, they reach out to the DNS server responds, not available. So then they aren't able to connect. And then the admins go one step further. They know this IP address. They look up to see what server is registered to that IP address. And they might find some cloud service hosting that server. And they say, go ahead and take down this IP address. That's malicious. The hacker has some code here in the botnet that says, okay, we've used A1 for a while, probably got detected. Now go to A2.com. A2.com. And he or she goes ahead and registers A2.com to a new IP address. So maybe 172.3.1.1. And so now all the machines reach out to the DNS server, says, oh yeah, I know what A2.com is. Here is your address. And then they go ahead and they connect to the new CNC server at this new IP address. And voila, you have control of the bots again. Another architecture that's really useful is called a P2 or peer-to-peer architecture, P2P. And in this architecture, all the bots can be both a bot, so B1, B2, B3, and B4. They can both be bots and CNC servers. So any bot could control the botnet. And then a hacker will simply connect to one of these bots. So even if you take down this bot, then you could just connect to this bot instead. Take down this bot, or just connect to this bot instead. And then when a new bot joins the network, they join here as well. And so this P2P architecture is very useful because there's no kind of central point to take down. Okay. So just a word on the Mirai botnet, which was a pretty famous botnet that affected a lot of machines, over 300,000 machines actually. It targeted IoT devices. And so IoT devices are mostly Linux machines running form of embedded Linux. Some machines actually run some RTOS, like FreeRTOS and so on. FreeRTOS, TOS. And so what they did is they actually said a lot of people don't change their default passwords on these things. The username and passwords are normally default. And so they went ahead and they scanned the internet and found routers, cameras that have these default passwords, and then they'll log into these machines with those default passwords. And then once they've logged in, they'll try to do a webget for their botnet code that contain their reverse shell. And if webget wasn't available, they did something clever. they created what was called an echo loader. So it would run the echo command followed by the series of bytes associated with webget, and then it would execute those bytes directly. Here you would write the file that represents webget to memory, and then using echo, and then go ahead and execute it. So it's called an echo loader. It's a really clever strategy. And then once you have webget, then you can go ahead and download your more complicated and involved botnet code. And every single one of these bots would actually go out and do the same scanning. So they would scan IP addresses to discover routers or cameras and so on. And then they would try the default username and passwords. So just no fancy vulnerability, just basic default username and passwords. And then once they were into these routers, they would load their botnet code. Great. So let's pop back to me talking and we'll close out the lecture. Oh, great. I hope this blackboarding session helps give you an overview of some of the concepts that are covered in the PDF. For interest, I've linked below a screenshot from a forum post by the creator of the Mirai botnet, talking about how difficult it was to take down that botnet and that he or she actually voluntarily decided to discontinue using it.
I hope you enjoyed this lecture and you're excited about the material to come. Great. So if you're enjoying these lectures, feel free to check out the full lecture series on Udemy. The link for that full lecture series is in the description below. Thanks.